Our son's pretend doctor, Dr. Nice, was actually his way of telling us about his pediatrician's inappropriate exams. I found the drawings while cleaning out Noah's backpack on a Wednesday evening in October. Crayon sketches stuffed between spelling worksheets and permission slips. The first one showed a stick figure child lying on a table with legs spread apart. A larger figure stood between the legs, drawn in dark purple crayon so thick the wax had torn through the paper. The word checkup was written across the top in Noah's careful 6-year-old handwriting. My hands started shaking before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. I pulled out the next drawing. Same stick figure child, same position, but this time the large purple figure had a speech bubble that said, "Dr. Nice says be good." The third drawing showed the child crying, tears drawn as bright blue streaks down the face, and the purple figure holding something that looked like a medical instrument. Or maybe not. Maybe something else. My stomach dropped so fast I had to sit down on the kitchen floor, surrounded by crumpled homework and applesauce packets, staring at my son's attempt to tell me something I'd been too blind to see. Noah was upstairs in his room playing the game he'd been playing for 3 months, the game where he pretended to be Dr. Nice giving checkups to his stuffed animals. The game I'd thought was adorable and encouraged, because it showed he wasn't afraid of doctors anymore. We'd been taking Noah to Dr. Lawrence Pemberton for 6 years, since Noah was born. Pemberton had delivered Noah at Mercy General Hospital and transitioned seamlessly into being our pediatrician. He was 58 years old with silver hair and reading glasses that hung on a chain around his neck. He wore colorful ties with cartoon characters and kept a jar of lollipops on his desk. Parents in our neighborhood recommended him constantly. He had a 40-year career in pediatric medicine with 0 complaints on his record. The waiting room walls were covered with thank you cards from grateful families. He'd won a community service award from the mayor just last year for his work providing free medical care to underserved children. My husband Daniel and I had trusted him completely, had never questioned leaving Noah alone with him during examinations, had been relieved to have such a competent and caring physician for our son. We'd been taking Noah for regular checkups every 3 months because Noah had been born with a mild heart murmur that required monitoring. The murmur had resolved by age 4, but Pemberton recommended continuing quarterly visits through age 7 just to be thorough. We'd agreed because we wanted to be cautious parents who didn't miss anything important. So every 3 months, we'd drive Noah to Pemberton's office in the Medical Plaza downtown, wait in the cheerful waiting room with the fish tank and the toy corner, and then watch Noah walk back to the examination room with a nurse while we stayed behind to handle insurance paperwork. Standard procedure. Every parent did it. The nurse would call us back after the examination was complete, and Pemberton would give us a summary of Noah's health status. Everything always looked great. Noah was developing normally, hitting all his milestones, completely healthy except for some seasonal allergies. The change in Noah had been gradual enough that we'd rationalized every piece of it. He'd started having nightmares about 3 months ago, waking up crying but unable to articulate what the dreams were about. Daniel and I had attributed it to starting 1st grade, a new teacher, adjusting to a longer school day. He'd become more anxious about bedtime, asking to sleep with his door open and the hallway light on. We'd thought he was going through a normal developmental phase. Lots of 6-year-olds were afraid of the dark. He'd started playing the Dr. Nice game around the same time. He'd line up his stuffed animals and announce he was Dr. Nice and needed to give them checkups. He'd make them lie down and spread their legs. He'd touch them in ways that had made me vaguely uncomfortable, but I told myself he was just imitating what he'd seen at the doctor's office. Kids processed experiences through play. The child development books all said so. When I'd asked Noah about Dr. Nice, he'd said it was a game about a doctor who was really, really nice to kids. He said Dr. Nice gave special checkups that were secrets between the doctor and the patient. He said Dr. Nice knew how to make checkups not hurt if you were good and stayed quiet. He said Dr. Nice took pictures to remember how good you were being. Every single detail should have been a blazing red flag. But I'd heard each one individually, separated by days or weeks, and I'd interpreted them through the lens of a parent who trusted the medical establishment and assumed my child was safe. The day before I found the drawings, we'd had Noah's most recent checkup with Pemberton. Daniel had been traveling for work, so I'd taken Noah alone. We'd arrived at 3:30 p.m. for our scheduled appointment. The waiting room had been empty except for one other mother with a toddler. Noah had been unusually quiet, clinging to my leg instead of playing with the toys like he normally did. I'd thought he was tired from school. The nurse, a woman named Beverly who'd worked with Pemberton for 15 years, had called Noah back at 3:45. She'd asked me to wait while she got his height and weight. Standard procedure. She'd brought Noah back after 5 minutes and said Dr. Pemberton would see him now. She'd said I should wait in the reception area because Pemberton was running behind and the examination rooms were small. She'd said they'd call me back when the examination was complete. I'd hesitated for just a moment because Noah's hand had tightened around mine and his eyes had gone wide. But Beverly had smiled warmly and said Noah was a big boy now and did great during examinations. She'd promised he'd be done in 15 minutes. I'd let go of my son's hand and walked back to the waiting room. I'd sat there for 25 minutes scrolling through my phone, answering work emails, completely unaware that something terrible was happening to my child 3 rooms away. When Beverly had finally called me back, Noah had been sitting on the examination table looking pale and quiet. His pants had been back on, but I'd noticed he'd put them on backwards with the tag showing in front. I'd thought he'd dressed himself quickly and gotten confused. Pemberton had been washing his hands at the sink, his back to us. He'd turned around smiling and said everything looked great, Noah was developing perfectly, see you in 3 months. The whole interaction had taken 90 seconds. Noah had been silent on the drive home. When I'd asked if the checkup went okay, he'd nodded without speaking. When I'd asked if Dr. Pemberton had been nice, Noah had flinched and said, "Dr. Nice is always nice." I'd thought the phrasing was odd but hadn't pushed. Noah had gone straight to his room when we got home and played the Dr. Nice game with his stuffed animals for 2 hours, making them lie down and spread their legs while he touched them and said, "Good patients stay quiet." Now, sitting on my kitchen floor holding those drawings, every moment from the past 3 months crashed into me with brutal clarity. The nightmares, the anxiety, the game, the backwards pants, the flinch when I'd said Pemberton's name. My son had been trying to tell me in every way a 6-year-old could, and I'd missed every single signal because I'd trusted a man with credentials and community awards and 40 years of experience. I'd trusted the system. The system had failed my son, and I'd been complicit in that failure by not questioning, by not pushing, by not trusting my child's behavior over a doctor's reputation. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called Daniel. He was in Seattle for a conference but answered on the second ring. I couldn't speak at first, couldn't form words around the horror clogging my throat. "Something's wrong," I finally managed to say. "Something's really wrong with Noah." Daniel's voice shifted immediately from casual to alert. He asked what happened, if Noah was hurt, if we needed an ambulance. I said no, but I'd found drawings and I thought something bad had been happening at the pediatrician's office. I said I thought Dr. Pemberton might have been hurting Noah. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Daniel said, "What?" in a voice I'd never heard him use before, flat and dangerous. I described the drawings, my words tumbling over each other. I told him about the Dr. Nice game and how Noah had been acting and the backwards pants and every detail I'd dismissed. Daniel said he was booking the next flight home. He said don't talk to Pemberton, don't call the office, don't do anything until he got there. He said we needed to be smart about this and not give Pemberton any warning. I agreed and ended the call. And then I went upstairs to Noah's room, moving like I was underwater. He was on his floor arranging his stuffed animals in a line. His teddy bear was lying on its back with its legs spread apart. Noah was holding a toy thermometer and saying, "Dr. Nice needs to check inside to make sure you're healthy." I stood in the doorway watching my son reenact his own abuse with his toys, and something broke inside me that I knew would never fully repair. I walked into the room slowly and sat down on the floor next to him. I asked in the calmest voice I could manage if he could tell me about Dr. Nice. Noah's hands froze on the teddy bear. He looked at me with wide eyes and said he wasn't supposed to tell. I said it was okay. He could tell me anything and he wouldn't be in trouble. Noah's eyes filled with tears. He said Dr. Nice told him that checkups were private and good boys didn't tell their mommies about special examinations. He said Dr. Nice said mommies would be mad if they knew about the secret checkups because mommies didn't understand doctor work. He said Dr. Nice took pictures on his phone to remember what good boys looked like during examinations. He said Dr. Nice touched him in his private area and said it was normal doctor stuff that all boys needed, but it had to be a secret or the checkups wouldn't work anymore. My 6-year-old son had been groomed into silence by a pediatrician who'd been systematically sexually abusing him during medical examinations, while I sat in the waiting room trusting the process. I asked Noah, my voice breaking, if Dr. Nice was the same person as Dr. Pemberton. Noah nodded slowly. I asked how many times this had happened. Noah started counting on his fingers and got to 8 before he stopped and said, "Lots of times. 8 appointments. 8 times my son had been abused while I'd waited in the next room doing absolutely nothing to protect him." I pulled Noah into my lap and held him while he cried. I told him it wasn't his fault, that Dr. Nice had been lying, that what happened wasn't normal doctor stuff, that I was sorry for not protecting him. Noah sobbed into my shirt and said he'd tried to show me with his drawings and his game, but he didn't know how to use the right words. He said Dr. Nice told him that if he told directly, something bad would happen to me and Daddy. He said Dr. Nice showed him a news article on his computer about a car accident and said that's what happens when boys break doctor-patient confidentiality. The sophistication of the manipulation made me want to vomit. Pemberton had weaponized my son's love for us, had turned Noah's desire to protect his parents into a tool for maintaining silence. Pemberton had studied child psychology well enough to know exactly how to trap a 6-year-old in a web of secrets and threats. This wasn't opportunistic abuse. This was calculated predation by someone who'd probably been doing this for decades. I thought about all those thank you cards in his waiting room, all those grateful parents, and wondered how many of them had sent their children into examination rooms where Pemberton had hurt them while convincing them it was medicine. I thought about the Community Service Award and the spotless record and realized that Pemberton's reputation had been his greatest weapon, the thing that made questioning him impossible. Daniel arrived home at 11:30 p.m. having caught the last flight from Seattle. He'd called from the airport and I told him everything Noah had disclosed. Daniel had been silent on the phone for a long time before saying we needed to call the police immediately. We'd put Noah to bed together, both of us lying next to him in his small bed until he finally fell asleep. Then we'd gone downstairs to the kitchen where those drawings were still spread across the table, and we'd called 911. The dispatcher had connected us to Detective Rita Alvarez from the Special Victims Unit, who said she'd come to our house immediately. Detective Alvarez arrived at 12:15 a.m. with her partner, Detective James Kowalski. Alvarez was in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much. Kowalski was younger, maybe early 30s, with the careful demeanor of someone who'd been trained in trauma-informed interviewing. They sat at our kitchen table and looked at Noah's drawings while we explained everything. Alvarez took detailed notes on a tablet, asking specific questions about dates and times and exact words Noah had used. She asked if we still had the clothes Noah had worn to his last appointment. I said yes, they were in the laundry hamper. She asked us not to wash them, that they might need them for evidence. She asked if Noah had mentioned anything about Pemberton taking photographs or videos. I said yes, Noah had mentioned pictures. Alvarez's jaw tightened and she exchanged a look with Kowalski that made my stomach hurt. She asked if we'd noticed any physical changes in Noah, any injuries or complaints about pain. I said no, nothing obvious, but we hadn't been looking for signs of abuse because we'd had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Alvarez explained that we'd need to take Noah to the Children's Advocacy Center for a forensic interview and medical examination. She said the interview would be conducted by specialists trained to talk to children about abuse without leading questions or suggestions. She said the examination would be done by a pediatric sexual assault nurse examiner who could document any physical evidence. She warned us that the process would be difficult for Noah and for us, but it was necessary to build a case against Pemberton. She said they'd also be getting a warrant to search Pemberton's office, computers, and phone, looking for the photographs Noah had mentioned. She said child sexual abuse cases were complicated, that they'd need to build an overwhelming case because defense attorneys would attack every aspect of the investigation. She said Pemberton would likely hire expensive lawyers and claim innocence. She said we needed to be prepared for a long, difficult process. Kowalski added that we should document everything Noah said from this point forward, that we should write down his disclosures with dates and times and exact language. He said we shouldn't ask leading questions or suggest details, just let Noah tell us things in his own words. He gave us a card for a child trauma therapist named Dr. Angela Burton, who specialized in working with young victims of sexual abuse. He said getting Noah into therapy quickly would be crucial for his recovery, and would also strengthen the case by showing consistent disclosure over time. The two detectives left at 1:30 a.m. with Noah's drawings and evidence bags and a promise that they'd move quickly on getting warrants. Alvarez said they'd call us in the morning to schedule the forensic interview. She warned us not to contact Pemberton or his office under any circumstances, that any contact could jeopardize the investigation. Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table after they left, not speaking, not moving, just existing in the horrible space of knowing our son had been hurt and we'd failed to protect him. The forensic interview happened 2 days later at the Children's Advocacy Center, a building designed to look friendly and non-threatening with colorful walls and comfortable furniture. The interviewer was a woman named Christine Lopez, who'd worked with child abuse victims for 12 years. She explained to us before the interview that she'd talked to Noah alone in a room equipped with video cameras, that we could watch on a monitor from another room, that the recording would be used as evidence so Noah wouldn't have to testify multiple times. She said she'd let Noah control the pace and wouldn't push him to disclose more than he was comfortable sharing. She said we needed to prepare ourselves for potentially hearing details we didn't know yet. Daniel and I sat in the observation room watching on a small screen as Christine talked to Noah. She started by asking him about school and his favorite toys, building rapport and making him comfortable. Then she gently asked if he knew why he was there. Noah said yes, because of Dr. Nice. Christine asked if Dr. Nice was a real person or a pretend person. Noah said real. He said Dr. Nice's other name was Dr. Pemberton. Christine asked if Noah could tell her about the times Dr. Pemberton had done things that made him uncomfortable. Noah described 8 separate incidents spanning 6 months. Each examination had followed the same pattern. Beverly, the nurse, would bring Noah back to the examination room and take his height and weight. Then she'd leave and Dr. Pemberton would come in alone. He'd start with normal doctor things like listening to Noah's heart and looking in his ears. Then he'd tell Noah he needed to do a special examination that was important but private. He'd have Noah remove his pants and underwear and lie on the examination table. He'd tell Noah to spread his legs and stay very still. Then Pemberton would touch Noah's genitals, claiming he was checking for normal development. He'd make the touching last several minutes while describing what he was doing in medical terms Noah didn't understand. He'd tell Noah this was a very special kind of examination that only the smartest doctors knew how to do. He'd say most doctors didn't do such thorough checkups, but he was being extra careful to make sure Noah was completely healthy. Pemberton had taken photographs during at least 4 of the examinations. He'd use his personal cell phone and tell Noah he was documenting normal development for his medical records. He'd position Noah in specific ways and take multiple pictures. He'd tell Noah to smile sometimes or to look at the camera. Pemberton had also shown Noah pornographic images on his computer during 2 of the examinations. He'd pulled up what he called educational materials and shown Noah pictures of other children in similar positions. He'd said this was what all boys looked like during proper medical examinations. He'd used the images to normalize what he was doing and to convince Noah that this was standard medical practice. The grooming had been sophisticated. Pemberton had never explicitly told Noah not to tell his parents. Instead, he'd framed everything as standard medical procedure that parents didn't need to know about because it was routine. He'd said parents would be confused if Noah tried to explain the special examinations because parents weren't doctors and didn't understand medical testing. He'd said the examinations were like secrets between doctors and patients that helped the medicine work better. He'd only mentioned potential consequences once, during the 6th examination, when he'd casually shown Noah that news article about the car accident, and said how terrible it would be if anything happened to Noah's parents because someone broke medical confidentiality rules. The threat had been delivered so subtly that Noah hadn't even recognized it as a threat, just as a scary fact about what happens when people share private information. Watching my son describe this systematic abuse to Christine Lopez while sitting in a child-sized chair surrounded by stuffed animals was the worst experience of my life. Daniel and I held hands so tightly our fingers went numb, both of us crying silently while Noah's small voice explained how Dr. Nice had hurt him over and over while telling him it was medicine. The medical examination happened immediately after the interview. The pediatric sexual assault nurse examiner was a woman named Sharon Kim, with 15 years of experience in forensic nursing. She explained that she'd be checking for any physical evidence of abuse and documenting Noah's body with photographs for the investigation. She said most child sexual abuse doesn't leave obvious physical injuries, especially when the perpetrator is careful, so the absence of findings wouldn't mean nothing happened. She said she'd be gentle and would stop if Noah became too uncomfortable. Noah was incredibly brave during the examination, lying still and answering Sharon's questions about whether anything hurt. The physical examination found evidence of repeated trauma to Noah's genital area. Sharon documented scarring consistent with repeated touching and manipulation over an extended period. She found no evidence of penetration, but significant evidence that Noah had been subjected to repeated genital contact. She collected DNA samples and documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. She said the findings were consistent with Noah's disclosure and would be included in the evidence against Pemberton. After the examination, Sharon sat down with Daniel and me and explained what she'd found in clinical terms. She said Noah's body showed signs of chronic abuse, meaning this had been happening regularly for months. She said the injuries would heal physically, but the psychological trauma would require ongoing therapy. She gave us more information about Dr. Angela Burton and strongly recommended we get Noah into therapy within the week. She said children who received early intervention after abuse tended to recover better than those who didn't get support. Detective Alvarez called us that evening to say they'd executed search warrants on Pemberton's office and home. They'd seized his computers, his cell phone, tablets, external hard drives, and file cabinets full of patient records. The initial search of his phone had revealed over 300 photographs of children in various states of undress, all apparently taken in his examination room. The metadata on the photos showed they'd been taken over a period of 8 years. 8 years of Pemberton photographing children during medical examinations. The digital forensics team would need several weeks to analyze everything they'd seized, but the initial findings were more than enough to arrest Pemberton. Alvarez said they'd arrested him at his home that afternoon. He'd been charged with 8 counts of sexual assault of a child, 8 counts of sexual exploitation of a child, possession of child pornography, and production of child pornography. Each charge carried a potential prison sentence of decades. Pemberton was being held on $500,000 bail at the county jail. His medical license had been immediately suspended by the state medical board pending investigation. Alvarez said they'd be contacting the families of other children identified in the photographs. She warned us that the case would become public very quickly, and we should prepare for media attention. She said Pemberton's arrest would likely lead to other victims coming forward. She said the investigation was going to get much bigger before it was resolved. She was right about the media attention. By the next morning, Pemberton's arrest was the lead story on every local news station. Prominent pediatrician arrested on child sex abuse charges ran on repeat with Pemberton's professional headshot displayed next to headlines about betrayed trust and systemic failures. The medical plaza where his office was located was surrounded by news vans. Parents were being interviewed in the parking lot expressing shock and horror. Several parents said they'd trusted Pemberton completely and couldn't believe he was capable of such things. Others said they'd noticed strange things over the years but hadn't wanted to question a respected physician. The comment sections on news articles filled with parents sharing concerns they'd dismissed, behaviors they'd rationalized, moments they'd ignored because Pemberton had seemed so trustworthy and professional. The state medical board launched an investigation into how Pemberton had maintained an untarnished record for 40 years, despite allegedly abusing children throughout his career. They reviewed his licensing history and found that he'd worked at 4 different practices over 4 decades, moving every 10 years. Each move had been framed as a career advancement or a desire for change, never raising red flags. But the pattern suggested he might have been moving to avoid detection, relocating before enough complaints accumulated to trigger serious investigation. The medical board found that 2 complaints had been filed against Pemberton in the 1990s at a previous practice, both from parents who'd reported that their children seemed afraid of him or had made vague statements about uncomfortable examinations. Both complaints had been investigated internally by the practice and dismissed as misunderstandings. Parents had been told they were overreacting or misinterpreting normal pediatric care. The practice had closed the complaints without reporting them to the medical board, as was common at the time. Pemberton had left that practice 6 months later and started fresh with no blemishes on his record. The system had failed to track him, failed to identify patterns, failed to protect children across 4 decades and 4 practices. The medical board's investigation revealed that dozens of complaints had been filed against pediatricians statewide over the past 20 years, but most were handled internally by practices and never reported to licensing authorities. There was no centralized database tracking complaints against physicians, no system for identifying patterns of concerning behavior across different practices. Pemberton had exploited these gaps systematically, moving when necessary and relying on the medical establishment's tendency to protect its own reputation over patient safety. Our civil attorney, a woman named Patricia Russo, who specialized in medical malpractice and institutional abuse, explained that we'd be suing not just Pemberton, but also his practice, the hospital system that credentialed him, and potentially the medical board for failing to protect Noah and other victims. She said the case would likely settle before trial because the evidence was overwhelming, and the institutions would want to avoid the publicity of a trial. She said we were looking at potentially millions in damages for Noah's medical care, therapy, and the lifetime of trauma Pemberton had inflicted. She said the money wouldn't fix what happened, but it would ensure Noah had resources for recovery and would send a message that institutions couldn't protect predators without consequences. Patricia filed the civil suit 3 weeks after Pemberton's arrest, naming him, his practice, 3 other physicians who worked with him, Beverly the nurse, the practice management company, and the hospital system. The complaint alleged that multiple people had been in positions to notice Pemberton's inappropriate behavior but had failed to act. It alleged that the practice had prioritized reputation and revenue over patient safety. It alleged that Beverly had facilitated abuse by ensuring parents stayed in the waiting room and children were alone with Pemberton. It alleged systemic failure at every level. The practice responded by claiming shock at the allegations and insisting they'd had no knowledge of Pemberton's activities. They suspended Beverly pending investigation. They hired a crisis management firm to handle media relations. They closed Pemberton's office permanently and reassigned his patients to other physicians. They released a statement saying they were cooperating fully with law enforcement and were committed to patient safety. The statement felt hollow and defensive, more concerned with limiting liability than acknowledging the catastrophic failure to protect the children in their care. Detective Alvarez called us 6 weeks after Pemberton's arrest with an update on the investigation. The digital forensics team had analyzed all the devices seized from Pemberton's office and home. They'd found over 2,000 photographs and 50 videos of children during medical examinations. The files dated back 12 years, suggesting Pemberton had been digitally documenting his abuse since cameras became common on phones. The images showed dozens of different children, all between ages 4 and 8, all in Pemberton's examination room, all in positions or states of undress that had no legitimate medical purpose. The forensics team had also found that Pemberton had been active in online forums where pedophiles traded images and discussed techniques for accessing children. He'd shared some of his photographs with other members of these forums. He'd discussed his methods for grooming children and parents. He'd described how to frame inappropriate touching as legitimate medical examination. He'd been part of a network of medical professionals who used their positions to abuse children and documented strategies for avoiding detection. The revelation that Pemberton had been part of an organized network was sickening and terrifying. Detective Alvarez said the FBI was now involved because the online trading of images crossed state lines, making it a federal case. The FBI had identified several other medical professionals in the forum and was coordinating arrests across multiple states. Pemberton's case was part of a much larger investigation into what they were calling a professional predator network of doctors, dentists, teachers, and coaches who used their positions of trust to abuse children systematically. Alvarez said they'd identified 38 child victims from Pemberton's files so far. They were in the process of contacting families and conducting interviews. Many families had no idea their children had been victimized. Some children were now teenagers who'd been abused years ago when they were in elementary school. Some families had moved away and would be difficult to locate. The investigation was massive and would take years to fully resolve. Each new victim identified meant another family destroyed, another childhood stolen, another failure by the systems meant to protect children. The other victims began coming forward within weeks of Pemberton's arrest. Parents called the tip line Detective Alvarez had established, reporting that their children had described similar experiences during examinations with Pemberton. Some children had created their own coping mechanisms like Noah's Dr. Niece game. One 8-year-old girl had drawn hundreds of pictures of bad checkups that her parents had dismissed as creative expression. One 7-year-old boy had started acting out medical examinations with his younger sister, mimicking inappropriate touching that his parents had chalked up to normal curiosity. One 10-year-old who'd been Pemberton's patient 3 years ago had recently disclosed abuse to his school counselor after seeing news coverage of the arrest and realizing what had happened to him wasn't normal medicine. Every family had missed signs because Pemberton's reputation made questioning him seem absurd. Every family had trusted the system and the system had failed them completely. The parents formed a support group that met weekly at the community center. 23 families showed up to the first meeting, all of us destroyed by the realization that we'd unknowingly delivered our children to a predator. We sat in a circle in a too-bright room sharing our guilt and rage and horror. Some parents were further along in processing than others. Some were still in the denial phase, wanting to believe their children had misunderstood or exaggerated. But most of us were in the same place of accepting that Pemberton had systematically abused our children while we sat in his waiting room praising his bedside manner. We shared information about therapists and attorneys. We discussed how to talk to our children about the legal process. We cried together and raged together and slowly started building a community from shared trauma. One father, Marcus Wellington, stood up during the third meeting and said we needed to do more than just sue and wait for the criminal trial. He said we needed to advocate for policy changes that would prevent this from happening to other children. He said we needed mandatory oversight of pediatric examinations, required presence of parents or third parties during any genital examinations, better training for recognizing signs of abuse, centralized tracking of complaints against medical professionals, and criminal penalties for institutions that failed to report abuse. Marcus's daughter had been one of Pemberton's victims for 2 years before Marcus had finally noticed she was terrified of doctor appointments and pushed her to explain why. By then, the abuse had already damaged her in ways that would take years of therapy to address. The support group evolved into an advocacy organization that we called Families for Medical Accountability. We met with state legislators and presented data on how Pemberton had exploited gaps in oversight. We pushed for legislation requiring video recording of all pediatric examinations involving genital exams. We advocated for mandatory parent presence during examinations unless the child specifically requested privacy. We called for reform of how medical complaints were tracked and investigated. Some legislators were receptive, seeing the political value in protecting children. Others resisted, claiming the reforms would create unnecessary burden on physicians and erode doctor-patient confidentiality. The medical associations fought us hard, arguing that our proposed changes would make it difficult to practice medicine and would be based on one extreme case rather than systemic problems. They insisted Pemberton was an aberration, a monster who didn't represent the profession. They refused to acknowledge that the profession's self-protective culture had enabled Pemberton for 4 decades. The political battle was exhausting, but we kept pushing because we knew other Pembertons existed in the system, protected by reputation and institutional reluctance to investigate respected professionals. Pemberton's trial was scheduled for 18 months after his arrest, an eternity of waiting for justice while Noah continued processing his trauma in weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Angela Burton. Noah's progress was slow and nonlinear. Some weeks he seemed okay, playing normally and sleeping through the night. Other weeks he'd regress, having nightmares about Dr. Nice and refusing to go anywhere near medical buildings. Dr. Burton said this was normal, that trauma recovery wasn't a straight line, that Noah might struggle with trust in medical settings for years or possibly forever. She recommended we find a female pediatrician when Noah needed medical care, someone who'd be patient with his trauma responses and willing to accommodate his need for security. She said we should never force Noah into medical situations that felt unsafe, that rebuilding his sense of safety and control was more important than routine checkups. Daniel and I both took time off work to focus on Noah's recovery. Daniel reduced his travel schedule to almost nothing. I shifted to part-time hours. We rearranged our entire lives around making Noah feel secure. We let him sleep in our bed when he needed to. We validated his fears instead of trying to rationalize them away. We answered every question he had about what had happened and why, trying to help him understand that Dr. Nice had been lying about everything, that the abuse was never medicine, that Noah hadn't done anything wrong by believing a trusted adult. The criminal trial finally began on a Monday in March, 19 months after Pemberton's arrest. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Nathan Cross, a 15-year veteran of the Sex Crimes Unit who'd successfully prosecuted dozens of child abuse cases. Cross had built an overwhelming case against Pemberton, including testimony from 12 child victims, forensic evidence from the medical examinations, the photographs and videos seized from Pemberton's devices, and testimony from digital forensics experts about the online trading of images. The defense was led by Arthur Feldman, an expensive attorney known for defending high-profile criminals. Feldman's strategy was predictable: attack the children's credibility, suggest false memories or coaching by parents, argue that the photographs were legitimate medical documentation, claim that Pemberton had been conducting thorough examinations that had been misinterpreted by unsophisticated patients and overprotective parents. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Daniel and I attended every day, sitting in the gallery with the other victim families while our children's abuse was described in clinical detail to a courtroom full of strangers. The prosecution called expert witnesses who explained how medical professionals could exploit their authority to abuse children systematically. They called Dr. Angela Burton, who testified about trauma responses in children and how Noah's behavioral changes were consistent with ongoing sexual abuse. They called Sharon Kim, who explained the physical findings from Noah's medical examination and what they indicated about repeated inappropriate touching. They called Christine Lopez, who walked the jury through Noah's forensic interview and explained why his disclosure was credible and consistent with genuine abuse rather than false allegations. They called Detective Alvarez, who testified about the investigation, the evidence seized, the photographs found, and Pemberton's activities in online predator forums. Then they called the child victims. Noah testified on a Wednesday afternoon in a small room connected to the courtroom via video feed, an accommodation for child witnesses designed to minimize trauma. The judge, jury, attorneys, and spectators watched on screens while Noah sat in a comfortable room with just the prosecutor and a victim advocate present. Nathan Cross asked Noah to explain what Dr. Nice had done during checkups. Noah, now 7 years old and 19 months removed from his last appointment with Pemberton, described the abuse clearly and calmly. He explained about the special examinations and the private touching and the photographs. He said Dr. Nice had told him it was medicine, but it had felt wrong and scary. He said he'd tried to tell us through his drawings and his games, but hadn't known how to use real words for what was happening. Arthur Feldman tried to cross-examine Noah gently, aware that aggressive questioning of a 7-year-old would alienate the jury. He asked if Noah might have misunderstood what Dr. Pemberton was doing. Noah said no. He asked if Noah's parents had told him what to say. Noah said no. He asked if Noah was sure the touching really happened, or if maybe he'd imagined it. Noah looked directly at the camera and said, "It really happened, and it was really bad, and Dr. Nice is a liar." The courtroom was silent after Noah's testimony. Several jurors were visibly emotional. One woman was crying openly. The defense had no effective rebuttal to a 7-year-old describing his abuse with heartbreaking clarity. The other victims testified over the next week. Each child's testimony followed similar patterns, describing the same grooming techniques, the same inappropriate touching, the same photography, the same manipulation and threats. The consistency across 12 independent victims made it impossible to argue they were all mistaken or lying. These children didn't know each other, came from different neighborhoods and different socioeconomic backgrounds, had different family structures and different levels of sophistication. Yet they all described the same predatory behavior by Pemberton during medical examinations. The defense tried to create doubt by calling expert witnesses who testified about false memories and the suggestibility of children. They argued that aggressive police questioning and therapist leading could create false abuse allegations. But their experts were destroyed on cross-examination when Nathan Cross asked them to explain how 12 children could develop identical false memories about specific abuse techniques without coordination. The experts had no good answers. Arthur Feldman called character witnesses who testified about Pemberton's reputation in the community and his decades of service to children. Former patients, now adults, said Pemberton had been a caring physician who'd never done anything inappropriate during their childhood examinations. But Nathan Cross pointed out that the absence of abuse in some cases didn't disprove abuse in others, that predators were selective about victims and careful about which children they targeted. Cross noted that Pemberton had specifically selected young boys between ages 4-8 who fit certain vulnerability profiles. He'd avoided older children who might better understand and articulate inappropriate behavior. He'd avoided children with parents who were physicians or attorneys or particularly assertive. He'd been calculating about victim selection, and the character witnesses were simply people who hadn't fit his preferred victim profile. Pemberton chose not to testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right. His attorneys had clearly decided that putting him on the stand would be too risky given the overwhelming evidence. The jury would see his silence as implicit admission of guilt, but any testimony he gave would open him to devastating cross-examination about the photographs, the online trading, the documented pattern of abuse across multiple victims. Feldman's closing argument was weak, essentially conceding that inappropriate touching had occurred, but arguing it was overzealous medical examination rather than sexual abuse, that Pemberton had been trying to be thorough and had poor judgment about boundaries rather than criminal intent. The argument was pathetic and insulting, suggesting that repeatedly photographing children's genitals during unnecessary examinations was somehow a medical mistake rather than deliberate predation. Nathan Cross's closing argument was powerful and damning. He walked the jury through the evidence systematically, showing how Pemberton had groomed children and parents, had isolated children from their parents during examinations, had touched children inappropriately while framing it as medicine, had photographed children for his sexual gratification, had traded those images with other predators online, and had manipulated children into silence through threats disguised as medical confidentiality. Cross showed the jury specific photographs from Pemberton's collection that had no possible legitimate medical purpose, images of children positioned in sexual ways, close-ups of genitalia, videos of extended touching that served no diagnostic function. He reminded the jury of Noah's testimony about Dr. Nice and the secret checkups. He asked the jury to imagine their own children in that examination room, alone with Pemberton, being touched inappropriately while being told it was normal medicine. He said that Pemberton had betrayed the most fundamental trust that existed in society, the trust between parents and the physicians they chose to care for their children. He said that Pemberton had turned medical examinations into opportunities for sexual abuse, had weaponized his authority and knowledge to victimize children systematically for at least 12 years and probably much longer. He asked the jury to hold Pemberton accountable for every crime he'd committed and to send a message that medical professionals who abused their positions would face justice. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 87 counts. The courtroom erupted in quiet crying and relieved exhales when the verdicts were read. Pemberton showed no emotion, sitting perfectly still at the defense table while the jury foreman read guilty 87 times. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 4 weeks later. Pemberton was remanded to custody to await sentencing. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he didn't look at any of the victim families. He stared straight ahead with dead eyes, a monster finally caught but still unwilling to acknowledge the damage he'd caused. Sentencing day brought all the victim families back to court one final time. The judge allowed impact statements from families who wanted to speak. 21 parents stood up and described how Pemberton's abuse had devastated their children and families. Marcus Wellington talked about his daughter's attempted suicide at age 9, 2 years after Pemberton had abused her. Another mother described her son's complete inability to trust medical professionals, how he'd developed serious health problems because he refused to see doctors for necessary care. Another father talked about the rage he felt knowing his daughter had been photographed naked by her pediatrician, that those images had been traded online with other predators, that his daughter's abuse had been commodified and distributed to satisfy other monsters. When it was my turn, I stood up and looked at Pemberton sitting at the defense table. I said that Noah had trusted him completely, that we'd all trusted him, that he'd exploited that trust to hurt my son repeatedly while convincing Noah it was medicine. I said Noah still had nightmares about Dr. Nice 2 years later, that he was terrified of medical settings, that simple things like getting a vaccine or having his temperature taken caused panic attacks. I said Pemberton had stolen Noah's sense of safety and his trust in adults and his ability to believe that his body was his own. I said no prison sentence could undo that damage, but I hoped Pemberton would spend the rest of his life in prison thinking about the children he'd hurt. The judge listened to all the impact statements without interruption. Then she addressed Pemberton directly. She said that in 23 years on the bench, she'd never seen a case that disgusted her more than this one. She said Pemberton had spent 40 years in a profession dedicated to children's health and had instead used that position to victimize children systematically. She said he'd violated every ethical principle of medicine, had betrayed families who'd trusted him with their most precious relationships, had damaged children in ways that would affect them for their entire lives. She said the evidence showed he'd been a calculating predator who'd carefully selected victims and perfected his methods over decades. She said his online activities proved he'd seen children not as patients, but as objects for his sexual gratification. The judge sentenced Pemberton to 328 years in prison, representing the maximum sentence on each count served consecutively. Even with time off for good behavior and various sentence reductions, he'd serve a minimum of 45 years before becoming eligible for parole. He was 60 years old at sentencing, meaning he'd be over 100 before he could potentially be released. It was effectively a life sentence. The judge also ordered him to pay $2.3 million in restitution to the victim families, though she acknowledged he had no assets left after legal fees and would never be able to pay more than a fraction. She ordered him to register as a sex offender for life and prohibited him from any contact with minors forever. As Pemberton was led away, he finally looked back at the courtroom. His eyes met mine for just a second. I saw nothing there. No remorse, no shame, no humanity. Just emptiness. He disappeared through the door and I knew I'd never see him again. The civil cases settled 6 months after the criminal trial. The medical practice, the hospital system, and their insurance carriers agreed to pay a total of $18 million to be distributed among the 38 identified victims and their families. The settlement included no admission of liability, but required significant policy changes including mandatory video recording of all pediatric examinations involving genital exams, required presence of a parent or third-party observer during such examinations, annual training for all staff on recognizing abuse, and implementation of a centralized complaint tracking system. The practice itself was dissolved, all remaining physicians retiring or finding positions elsewhere. Beverly, the nurse who'd facilitated Pemberton's access to children by ensuring parents stayed in waiting rooms, lost her nursing license permanently. The state medical board implemented new rules requiring physicians to report any colleague they suspected of abuse, with criminal penalties for failure to report. They created a centralized database tracking complaints against physicians across all practices, making it impossible for predators to simply move and start fresh with clean records. They required that any physician with multiple complaints about boundary violations or inappropriate behavior undergo evaluation before being allowed to continue practicing. The reforms were named Noah's Law, after my son, who'd been brave enough to keep trying to tell us about Dr. Nice until we finally understood. Our portion of the settlement was $650,000, which we put into a trust for Noah's future medical care, therapy, and education. The money felt meaningless compared to what had been taken from him, but it ensured he'd have resources for recovery for the rest of his life. Noah is 9 years old now, 3 years past his last examination with Pemberton. He still sees Dr. Angela Burton weekly for therapy. He's made remarkable progress in some ways. He can talk about what happened without falling apart. He understands that it wasn't his fault. He knows that Dr. Nice was actually Dr. Mean, a bad person who lied and hurt him. But he still struggles. He refuses to see male doctors for any reason. He has panic attacks when he needs medical care. Last year, when he needed stitches after falling off his bike, it took 3 hours and 2 sedatives to calm him enough for treatment. He has nightmares where Dr. Nice comes back. He draws pictures of doctors as monsters. He's in a social skills group for trauma survivors, learning how to trust people again. His childhood was fundamentally altered by Pemberton's abuse, and no amount of therapy or justice can fully restore what was stolen. But he's surviving. He's finding ways to be a kid again. He's playing soccer and reading Harry Potter and making friends who don't know about Dr. Nice. He's building a life beyond the trauma. That's all we can ask for. Daniel and I still carry guilt about missing the signs for so long. We're in our own therapy dealing with that guilt and learning how to parent a trauma survivor. We've become advocates for medical reform and child protection. We speak at medical schools and nursing schools about how predators operate in healthcare settings. We testify at legislative hearings about the need for oversight and accountability. We've built our lives around making sure Pemberton was the last pediatrician who could do this with such impunity. Sometimes I think about that moment when I found Noah's drawings in his backpack, when everything changed in an instant. I think about all the times before that when Noah had tried to tell us and we hadn't heard him. I think about the 8 checkups where I sat in the waiting room scrolling through my phone while my son was being abused in the next room. I think about how I'd praised Pemberton as a wonderful physician, had recommended him to other parents, had trusted him so completely that I'd handed my child to him without question. The guilt is crushing and probably always will be. But I also think about how Noah found a way to tell us despite everything Pemberton did to keep him silent. How he created Dr. Nice as a safe way to talk about something too terrible to put into direct words. How his 6-year-old brain figured out that he could communicate through his game and his drawings even though he couldn't use the real words for what was happening. He was braver and more clever than I'd been perceptive. He saved himself by refusing to give up on telling us. And eventually, we listened. That's what matters. Not that we were blind for too long, but that we finally opened our eyes and believed our child and fought for him. Pemberton is in prison. Noah is in therapy. The system has been changed in small but meaningful ways. It's not enough. Nothing could be enough. But it's something. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.